What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Modern video, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a beginner's guide for the black-green Yawgmoth deck in Modern. It's been a while since I've made one of these videos, just from the fact of I think it's pretty hard, at least nowadays, to kind of hit all the points in videos like this. I kind of started out trying to put in as much information as I can, but I'm going to set you on the right track if you're interested in playing black-green Yawgmoth. I think it is very, very well positioned in the format, even with Rhinos, I believe, being one of the best decks in the format. I think Yawgmoth is just very good against like everything else that you're willing to kind of take your chances in like the Rhinos matchup. But of course, before we get too deep into it and we explore the inner workings of the Golgari Yawgmoth deck, I would appreciate it if you are not already subscribed to the channel that you consider doing so and ring the notification bell. Shows you when my videos get posted, and it also is a free, easy way to support my channel. And if you go into the description down below, I will link the deck list that you see on screen right now. And then there's also a link to my Discord server as well. Feel free to join over there. And lastly, be sure to check out the Casual Spikes podcast that goes up every Saturday. We're going to be looking at some of the deck lists and kind of what happened at the European Regional Championship this past weekend, and look forward to other happenings that are going on in Modern and Pioneers of that issue as well. Even more reason to subscribe and ring notification bell so you know when that video and that episode goes up. So we have Golgari Yawgmoth, and the super basic way of thinking about Yawgmoth is that it is a creature combo deck that is kind of like backing up to kind of an aggro plan. And the deck has some further depth to it thanks to the introduction of a new card in Agatha's Soul's Cauldron. While not necessarily 4 of in the deck, it looks like they're averaging about 2 to 3 copies. I've seen a lot with 3. This one, I'm surprised, is only playing 2. I don't know if this was like kind of a concession to a budget, because I mean the card, I believe, on Moto is pretty expensive. But, you know, with like a rental service and stuff, I think I would lean more towards playing 3. But 2 Cauldron, I mean, you can't go wrong with 2 Cauldron, you know, and to be honest, like playing this in paper as well, if you just have none of it, and the deck being, you know, like $1,000, like having 2 Cauldron is going to be fine and accomplish its job a lot of the time. So the basic idea of the Yawgmoth strategy is this card, Yawgmoth, Thran Physician. It's a 2 generic and 2 black for a 2/4 human, legendary human, with protection from humans. You can pay a life, sacrifice another creature, put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and draw a card. Of note that if you sacrifice a creature and then you target something with the Yawgmoth, and that target, for whatever reason, is not valid anymore, whether it gets hexproof, whether it has protection, or it just ends up dying, what have you, before the ability actually resolves, you will not get to draw the card. So that's very important to kind of point out, because there are going to be some scenarios that do come up where you're trying to get rid of a creature, then your opponent tries to save it in response, and then you try to do something else to make sure that you can get rid of that creature, and then ultimately, you know, you're going to end up missing out on like drawing a card, you know. So there's also the secondary ability of paying 2 black and discarding a card to proliferate. So kind of like the first ability can feed into the second ability, and it's kind of a way that you can put tons of counters on different creatures that your opponent controls, while even in some cases for your undying creatures, boosting them up as well to kind of push through those final points of damage. Maybe not so much relevant now in the era where you have Agatha's Soul's Cauldron and you're technically playing less undying creatures and you're kind of playing more into this like creature combo strategy. It still can come up, and it's something to kind of keep an eye out for, because thanks to cards like Agatha's Soul's Cauldron, where you can just eat creatures, put counters on your own creatures, and then you can kind of boost them up with those with that proliferate ability on Yawgmoth. So this is the main engine piece. This is the card that you're going to hopefully Quarter Calling for, Eldritch Evolution for, or, you know, somehow get it into your graveyard from Grist activations, eating it with a Soul's Cauldron, and then turning one of your +1/+1 countered creatures into a Yawgmoth. So exactly what is going on with the combo, or what is the combo in general? Typically you want a Yawgmoth, which is just a 1 mana 1/1 with Undying that says whenever this creature dies, well, Undying reads, when this creature dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, return to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter. So you need a Yawgmoth, and then you either want a Hapatra, or you want another Yawgmoth or a Stranglergeist in play. And you, with that setup of either 2 Undying creatures or an Undying creature and a Hapatra with a Yawgmoth in play means that you can draw an amount of cards equal to your life total. Now, I don't recommend drawing equal to your life total because then that means you end up at 0. But typically, you need to be at like 1 to 2. You need to be at 2 life to be able to initiate the combo on your own. Obviously, the more life, the better, because that means more cards you can draw and more ways that you can kind of like respond to your opponent interacting with how you're going to win the game. But, you know, you can go down to like 1 card, and as long as like another creature dies, you're able to, you know, gain a life and then start like the combo and everything. So with that setup, you can draw as many cards as your life total dictates. And then you're essentially looking for like Court of Calling, and you're looking for like an Eldritch Evolution even to go get your win condition in Blood Artist. Now, there's some lists that are playing Zulaport Cutthroat. Kind of the difference between Cutthroat and Blood Artist. Blood Artist triggers no matter when a creature dies. This kind of helps out where you don't necessarily have like a win on board, but if you have like a Hapatra in play with a Yawgmoth and you have like a way to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, you can, you know, generate a snake, then sacrifice the snake to put a counter on a creature, and then you gain the life from the snake dying, and then you're able to kind of like shotgun your opponent's board, and then obviously get additional triggers from like Blood Artist and things like that. And if you want to kind of like get an explosive amount of snakes, you know, if you're, depending on how many, you know, creatures your opponent has in play and how much mana you have left available, you can just put a -1/-1 counter on each of the creatures. In sacrificing the snake, you end up with like 1 snake, but then if you activate Yawgmoth's ability to pay 2 black mana and discard a card to proliferate, that word's going to be very difficult for me today, I can tell. That way you can generate multiple snakes, because Hapatra cares about putting a 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature. Since you're doing it to different objects, you are able to create more snakes, which is like also another way that you can end up winning the game, is just by making a board full of snakes, or just having more sack fodder to Yawgmoth to be able to draw more cards and interact through removal spells on your Undying creatures. So that is in general like what we're trying to accomplish with this deck. I know that was like long-winded, but I think it's kind of important to kind of lay out the details and stuff of what's going on. Typically, in trying to get this set up, you're kind of looking for Court of Calling. Chances are, if you're like in the early turns of the game, you're not going to have enough mana to play a Yawgmoth and then, you know, cast like an Eldritch Evolution to go and, you know, get your Blood Artists and what have you. However, thanks to Court of Calling virtually being free with like Convoke, if you play something like a Wall of Roots, wherever it is right there, you play like a Wall of Roots, you get some of these like Undying creatures out, and even like a Patra or whatnot, you can, in theory, do it. The Undying creatures are kind of busted in this way, where you can like use them to Convoke to go get like a Yawgmoth, and then you can sacrifice them, and you essentially reset them to be untapped, and then you can Court of Calling with them as well. I guess to point out too, like I didn't really go over how the combo works, so real quick, Yawgmoth plus, you know, Hapatra or whatever. If you have 2 Yawgmoths in play, you need to sacrifice 1, choosing no targets, and it comes back with a +1/+1 counter. You draw a card. Then you take the Yawgmoth that does not have a -1/-1 counter on it, or it has a +1/+1 counter on it, excuse me. You sacrifice it and you target the Yawgmoth with a +1/+1 counter. With how counters work, when the Yawgmoth gets that -1/-1 counter, it will simultaneously have a +1/+1 counter and a -1/-1 counter, and when state-based actions are checked, that -1/-1 counter will take away the +1/+1 counter. This is important because we'll say that if the Yawgmoth that has a +1/+1 counter on it has 1 damage marked on it, and you go to put a -1/-1 counter on it, when state-based actions are checked, it has a -1/-1 counter and a +1/+1 counter on it, which, you know, virtually means that they cancel out, so it's a 1/1, but it has 1 damage marked on it so that it dies. So in the idea being that like this card would come back because like the counters cancel out, no, it'll actually die with a +1/+1 counter on it, which means that you will not get the Yawgmoth back. So that is something to know, that Orcish Bowmasters and things like that, or trying to attack into like tokens with like a Yawgmoth and stuff, is not a good idea if you're going to try to kind of shuffle around counters and draw cards, because you could potentially just lose the Yawgmoth altogether. And, you know, that's a pretty important piece of like the combo when you're just trying to then cobble together something to put like a Blood Artist into play and what have you. Hapatra, virtually the same way. You put a -1/-1 counter on something, so you could like sack the Yawgmoth that doesn't have a counter, to put a counter on the Patra. Patra doesn't care where that -1/-1 counter goes. It just matters it's on a creature. You then get to generate a snake, which means you can sacrifice a snake, target the Yawgmoth. You cancel out the counters. It ends up being a 1/1. You generate a snake, and then you can sacrifice the Yawgmoth, target the snake, and then like the snake gets a -1/-1 counter. Wolf comes back with a +1/+1 counter. You generate a snake because a creature had a -1/-1 counter put on it, and you can kind of loop from there, and that's how you can end up drawing a bunch of cards with either 2 undying creatures or an undying creature plus that Patra being the big thing. So going on, as we kind of go further, you have all these other creatures that kind of facilitate the game plan or help in some way to forward it. So you have Delighted Halfling and you have Ignoble Hierarch. You have 5 1-drop creatures that will end up producing mana, and then you have 4 Wall of Roots to generate even more mana. Wall of Roots is especially broken, in terms of it doesn't actually work properly on Moto, but it does add a ton of mana when you're looking at Court of Calling, and it does a lot of work in bridging the gap for Eldritch Evolution to kind of get you to Yawgmoth or the Shieldred that is in the deck. And this card being broken on Moto, this deck is worse on Moto, technically. I'm sure in more ways than one, but the big one being the tricks that you can do with Wall of Roots. In paper, if you have a Wall of Roots with 4 -0, -1 counters on it, you are able to either use it for mana and convoke it with a Court of Calling, or use it to Eldritch Evolution away to go get a Yawgmoth, with how casting spells work and what have you, that for some reason can't be done on Moto. You're not able to add a mana and then pay the additional cost of Court of Calling by tapping your creatures. It's not really an additional cost, but you're able to tap Wall of Roots for the Convoke and then add mana with the Wall of Roots to finish paying for the Court of Calling. And, obviously you'll lose the Wall of Roots when the spell goes on the stack, but you got to use it for 2 mana out of it. Evo, same way, you can announce the casting of the spell, activate Wall of Roots as a mana ability, which does not use the stack, and then sacrificing it after all costs have been paid to the Eldritch Evolution to then go get whatever thing you're going to get. And it ends up working out pretty well because the Wall of Roots would have died in that scenario. While it hasn't come up as much as you would think, at least in the number of games that I've played on Moto, it does come up some number of the time, and it is very annoying and inconvenient when it does happen. So that is something to keep an eye out for. Also, when you add mana with Wall of Roots on Moto, you cannot undo it. So just keep that in mind as well, that you are absolutely 100% sure that you want to add mana with Wall of Roots, because you cannot take it back. And I know on a stream or two that it has happened where I've done it, realized that I couldn't do the thing I wanted to do, I got in my own head, and you can't take it back. So unfortunately, Wall of Roots pretty buggy on Moto, but on paper, in paper and even still on Moto, it's one of your best creatures in the deck that aren't an Undying Creature or Yawgmoth. Or I guess even Shieldred too. It's great. It's probably your best dork. But yeah, you have 9 mana dorks total. I guess you technically have Dried Harbor as well. Dried Harbor is kind of a sneaky way that you can get another sacrifice threat, I guess, for Yawgmoth. It's kind of you can fetch it out, put it into play, block something, shoot something else, and end up drawing a card. And kind of getting some fresh looks, because a lot of this deck is just trying to set up a board that can kind of beat, a removal spell or two, or get into a position where it can kind of combo off and kill your opponent, regardless of what they have going on. Going further, you have Orcish Bowmaster playing kind of the same way that Wall of Roots plays, but being a 2 mana thing that you can play, and then it's going to help you cord for an additional, for the fact that it brings a body into play. It can get rid of your opponent's mana dorks, their own ignoble hierarchs, so they're playing them, just getting to ping Ragavans and stuff on the draw, or excuse me, when your opponent's on the draw. We know Bowmaster's a great card. It was the most played card in the European RC, and we'll continue to see the most play of probably any card in Modern, until he's either eventually banned, or they find a way to neuter Bowmasters with some other powerful card that ends up getting printed, which I don't think personally would be a good direction to go into, but it is what it is. But Bowmaster, getting to ping things, getting to kind of threaten decks that want to draw multiple cards. The One Ring, while not seeing as much play as it did when the Lord of the Rings set came out, Orcish Bowmaster is still, in a way, kind of a hard counter to those decks. Multiple Bowmasters are super annoying to deal with, especially when your opponent needs to draw more cards. So you can kind of put your opponent in a position where they need to draw more cards to deal with like your Shieldred, to deal with your Yawgmoth, but then they're getting dealt damage, from the Shieldred, and also getting pinged from the Orcish Bowmaster, making an even bigger creature. The Amassed thing gets a +1/+1 counter, so it's kind of like a free, creature that ends up having whatever abilities Agatha's Soul's Cauldron could end up producing from all these things that get eaten. You have Endurances to kind of mess with the graveyard decks. You have you have a Shieldred in here. Like, Shieldred just sometimes just straight up wins the game. Big enough to block a Rhino and survive combat, although it does feel bad when it gets fired, but chances are you're probably not even blocking a Rhino, or like you just don't care. Like, you just end up getting to a point where Shieldred is going to kind of dominate the game, in those like top deck wars. And I mean, there's times where I've just evoed for a Shieldred when I could have gotten Yawgmoth, and Yawgmoth would have been like halfway decent, but I felt like the pressure on board, plus just having a Shieldred to also get in like some more damage while bolstering your life total, also works pretty well with Yawgmoth, because this is a way that you can, sacrifice creatures. You end up drawing a card, you pay a life to do it, but then you draw a card and you end up gaining 2 life, so you're able to kind of like shuffle these creatures around and then also like bolster your life total while also sculpting the perfect 7-card hand. Lastly, you have Grist, which is a super interesting card with Agatha's Soul's Cauldron and just in this deck in general. So it is, when it isn't on the battlefield, it's a 1/1 insect creature in addition to its other types. So when it's in your deck, it's in the graveyard, it's exiled, it's in your hand, it's in the kitchen making a sandwich. It is a 1/1 insect creature, and in addition to its other types. So you are actually able to Court of Calling for it, and you're able to Eldritch Evolution for it. Getting 2/1 makes a 1/1 insect, helps with obviously Convoking, because it is a green and a black creature. And if you end up milling another Grist, you're able to then, perform that action an additional time of creating a 1/1 insect and putting a loyalty counter on Grist. -2, you may sacrifice a creature when you do destroy target creature or planeswalker. This ability is sneakily good because when you activate it, you're not having to sacrifice the creature right away. You activate it, and then when you go to resolve the ability, you're able to sack the creature and then target something. Then your opponent has the ability to interact with it, I believe, in that way of, like, after you perform the May action, your opponent gets to interact with that. But getting destroy target creature, getting destroy planeswalker, a very powerful ability, especially when you have like Yawgmoths and you have Stringerroot Geist and what have you. You have I guess Endurance is still not that very good of a card to sacrifice, but you have these cards that are going to come back, and you also have like these other cards that like you can sack to the Grist, and then you're able to eat with like Agatha's Soul's Cauldron, and then you have a bunch of them. Also, the fact that Agatha's Soul's Cauldron can eat a Grist, put a counter on something, and then everything you have with a +1/+1 counter is a Grist. It not super good, I would say, like in the first turn. I mean, if you have like 3 or 4 creatures with +1/+1 counters, you're just going to make a ton of insects, and really short of Rhinos, like that's just something super annoying to try to beat through, because then you just have so much mana for Court of Calling. Not only that, you can then find other ways to put counters on those creatures. You just end up having more and more Grists, where you just eat another creature. Who cares? Like, you're just having another Grist activation put into play, and then eventually like those creatures can then -2 destroy other creatures, or you eventually get up to the ultimate, you can just absolutely blow your opponent out. And that's kind of like another secret win condition of this deck is Grist Ultimate. You're sacrificing these creatures, you're putting them in the graveyard, you can activate Yawgmoth to pitch those cards, and then you end up fueling the graveyard even more. You tick up the Grist because of the proliferate, and then you end up ultimating it and potentially winning the game, or at least putting your opponent at such a low life total where, Shieldred or Orcish Bowmaster triggers, or just even casting Orcish Bowmasters can kind of end the game or put a ton of pressure on your opponent. So that is the makeup of the deck. In general, like, at least as far as the mana base is concerned, you're playing 4 Blooming Marsh, and then you're playing like 2 Overgrown Tomb. This deck wants to conserve its life total as much as it possibly can. So in doing that, there's times where you can kind of get yourself in trouble if you say fetch up like 2 basic forests, but then you only end up ever drawing like the swamp, or you draw like another Pendlehaven, or maybe you just draw an Overgrown Tomb. You can get yourself in trouble with that. That being said, you are kind of able to have some leeway with it. I mean, you have the 4 Blooming Marsh. Like, this is a land that's going to come into play untapped through the first few turns of the game. That isn't going to cost you life. You have this. You have a Misty Rainforest plus 4 Verdant Catacombs to end up getting your basic. I mean, really, basic forest is probably the most important thing to get over basic swamp. But your Verdant Catacombs are able to get, your basics, and of course get your dual lands in Overgrown Tomb, where if you need black mana at a pinch. Going even further, you have like Twilight Mire, which is like a way that you can filter in mana. This is a way that you could like fetch a basic forest on turn 1, and then you play like a Twilight Mire on turn 2. You're able to play all of your turn 2 cards, and then in additional, like, you can fetch more basics, where you can fetch your other basic forest, or you can go get your basic swamp, you can go get your catacombs tapped, and then you have access to more mana. Just a very versatile land. It feels bad when you have these, and this is like a one-lander, and you have a pretty good one-lander with Twilight Mire, but, aside from that, like, just the fixing that it adds is super potent and powerful. 2 Boseiju, 1 Takenuma as your utility lands. Boseiju is like everywhere in every green deck. It feels almost free. Tron is a pretty bad matchup, and while I don't expect you to necessarily run into a ton of Tron decks, it's still kind of nice to have Boseiju. Of course, like, there's other reasons to play Boseiju. You can kind of mess up your opponent's mana. They have some annoying artifacts. Maybe if someone's playing like a main deck Curse Scroll, what have you, or I guess Curse Totem, not Curse Scroll. Nobody's playing Curse Scroll, but a lot of people are playing Curse Totem specifically for this deck, and this is the kind of way that you can interact with them. In the mirror, you can kill their Agatha's Soul's Cauldron, and completely just neuter any development that they have, and like get those incremental advantages. Boseiju just does a lot of work and is worth playing, especially in these numbers, because again, you are playing a lot of green pips in the deck, and Yawgmoth and Shieldred you're just kind of usually tutoring for, especially when you have like 1 Evo and 4 Chord, you need that green mana. Colony Garden, in a way, is kind of like an untapped land on the turns that you're going to play Court of Calling, because it comes into play tapped, but it creates an 0/1 plant. So it's additional fodder for Yawgmoths to be sacrificed to. It also is like a land that comes into play untapped for like a Court of Calling, and then for like the future, I mean, it's kind of untap, and it's like it's producing 2 mana because it's using the plant plus getting to tap the land. So it's in a way kind of like a dual land. We'd seen some pretty cute versions that were playing the green-black bounce land in conjunction with Colony Garden, and then getting to play like the Arboreal Grazer and stuff, kind of doing cute things, but turns out Colony Garden is just good enough to play at least as a 1-of on its own in this deck. You have Pendelhaven to give your 1/1 creatures +1/+2 until end of turn. Now, this isn't necessarily for trying to kind of push through damage and everything. While it can do that, a lot of the time it is protecting your 1 toughness creatures. It is protecting your Yawgmoths from, dying if you're not ready for them to die. If you don't really have a way to reset the counter, you can kind of protect it to a point with Pendelhaven. Same thing with like Orgur's Bowmaster. Like, your 1/1s are not going to get pinged, as long as a Pendelhaven's in play, and it is pretty good tempo, if your opponent just kind of plays into it, or you're like forcing them to double spell to like beat an Orcus Bowmaster. I think you end up coming out on top kind of in that exchange, especially with how quickly Yawgmoth can go from having no board to, comboing off and killing your opponent. The sideboard, we talked about how bad the Rhinos matchup is, at least in videos before we've talked about how bad it is. I don't think I've talked about it here. It sucks. 4/4, the fact that they have Trample is the worst thing. If they didn't have Trample, this deck probably ends up being like 50-50, or at least like I would probably want to be playing the Yawgmoth side of it. But because they have Trample, you're not able to like kind of chump block them forever. You use your Wall of Roots even once, like Wall of Roots doesn't even block it, but then they can just fire, and it's bad. The matchup sucks. So you have these Fatal Pushes, you have Fatal Push, you have Chalice of the Void, you have cards like Thoughtseize, you have Soulless Jailer. I mean, I guess you could technically Terror Sunder, but 4 mana to like remove it really isn't that good. But you have like these options against the Rhinos players. I'd seen some versions playing Legion's End, which is, it exiles a creature with converted with mana value 2 or less, and then each other creature with the same name as that creature. Then you look at your opponent's hand and then take all copies of that card. And I believe it's just mainly for like the Rhinos matchup. I'm sure there's probably other matchups like you could bring it in for, but realistically, like the fact that for 2 mana you can end up getting rid of like two to 3 to 4 Rhinos. You know, obviously even more. You end up, you know, just destroying a lot of like their development and stuff. Of course, they have like their own backup plans and things like that, but you know, those decks can easily beat a Chalice of the Void nowadays. Like, that's not a very tall task for them to do, since they're way more interactive than any other Cascade decks that we've really seen throughout the history of Modern. But they can play through Chalice of the Void. They can play through cards like Soulless Jailer. They can play through like Thoughtseize and things like that. But I think from what this list does versus like what I would do, I would definitely at least play like 1 Legion's End somewhere in here to kind of counteract that. Everything else, I mean, like Fatal Push can come in like some other matchups. You have Thoughtseize is kind of like your one-stop shop for like destroying combo decks. Scavenging Ooze against the graveyard decks puts in a lot of work. It's something that can eat another creature from your opponent's graveyard, put a counter on it, and then you eat something with your Agatha's Soul's Cauldron, and boom, you have another creature that already puts +1/+1 counters on itself, having additional activated abilities. We talked about Terra Sunder. I mean, that's just getting to kind of be like a naturalize, and then upgrading to being, you know, just a hard removal spell for a lot of things, and ensuring that you can kind of be a little bit grindier in some of those matchups where you just need just a little bit more removal. Fulminator Mage is pretty good against like the decks that care about their lands. Titan seeing an uptick in play, and then also, you know, like the Tron variants and things like that. Just getting to blow up a land and really like sending your opponent back really in any matchup, whether they're playing like 3, 4, or 5 color decks. Fulminator Mage, blow up their land, Agatha's Soul's Cauldron to eat it, create more Fulminator Mages, and just send your opponent back to the Stone Age. You have Rex Sage just as like an easy tutorable target that is going to ETB and kill something. And then, of course, you have Force of Vigor. I believe Reclamation Sage being here, now that I'm thinking about it, is definitely, I mean, Sage and Force of Vigor, but like this is a way that you can kill like Cursed Totem without having to pay for an activated ability, because you would see like there was like another 2 mana card that you could pay 1 and sacrifice it to as Outland Liberator. You could pay 1 and sacrifice it and destroy something, but then on the flip side, if it attacked, you got to destroy something, and then you could also still pay 1 and sacrifice it to destroy something else. But obviously, it gets shut off by Cursed Totem, and even though it'd be pretty good with Agatha's Soul's Cauldron, just being able to make your creatures do that, you have Haywire Might now for that reason. So Liberator's just kind of like pushed out, and then Rex Sage used to do it on enters, and then Force of Vigor in like the hammer matchups and stuff. Like, you're just trying to survive like the early turns of the game. Like, if they try to go for a turn 2 kill, you can kind of blow them out with Force of Vigor, and then once you kind of establish Yawgmoth plus some Undying creatures or even a Patra, like, it's just game over. They're not really going to be able to have a board state that can survive just with all their 1 and 2 toughness creatures. So that is the Black-Green Yawgmoth deck for the Modern format. Like I said, this deck is pretty complicated. There's a lot of things to go over. This is a super long video. I'm going to tell it's probably going to be like a 29-30 minute video. But this is definitely like a good place to start, kind of explaining what cards, what they're doing here, what they can kind of accomplish, and what they're used for. There's tons of tricks that I probably don't even know about the Yawgmoth deck. But I can only pass along the information that I know for sure. This list, I would say, is pretty stock. There's like some few flex options. Like, you could go down like an endurance, either the endurances completely or one of them, and play like a main deck Fulminator Mage. I've seen lists doing that. I've seen other ones that have done pretty well that are playing the Spike Feeder. So then like there's a way to technically gain infinite life with a Spike Feeder and an Undying creature. You know, you end up like netting 1 life through the loop. You know, you sacrifice it. Target nothing, you draw a card, and then you comes back with a counter. You remove the counter to gain 2 life, because that's what Spike Feeder's ability is, and then you can sacrifice it, and so on. And it's like a self loop that is, I would say, pretty mana efficient in a way that you can end up getting Court of Calling and just winning the game that way. Ultimately, it's just kind of like what you expect. I would think that just playing like main deck Fulminator Mage would be pretty good, simply for the fact of just getting to blow up your opponent's lands can be good enough. Like, there's a lot of times where your opponents just don't, you know, game ones, they don't respect Blood Moon effects, they don't respect land destruction. So, you know, if you have your opponent that just kind of like goes and fetches up non-basic lands left and right, taking some damage and whatnot, and then like you turn 2 Fulminator Mage them into like turn 3, eat the Fulminator Mage, put a counter on like my Dork, sacrifice the Dork, blow up another one of your lands. You end up like in a way ramping yourself by like unramping them by just like blowing up their lands, and then all of your future creatures with +1/+1 counters, your Yawgmoths and your String Root Geist, become so much more threatening because even your opponent has to exile them, and if they can't exile them, they come back with counters. They end up blowing up their lands and further stunting their development, stuff like that. So this deck is crazy. It is something that is like a labor of love and something that you need to absolutely put a lot of time practicing in and understanding how the casting of spells work, and kind of like your math and mapping out like the first early turns of the game to get to a point where you can kind of combo, and then also understanding that like I can't combo and being willing to pivot off of it, because this deck is not just Yawgmoth or bust. There is quite a few games I would say it is like that, but it's not like if I never draw Yawgmoth, I'm never winning the game. This deck has an annoyingly good beatdown strategy that your opponent has to respect, because if they try to hold up mana and, not, and try to interact with a combo and you just never combo, it's pretty hard for them to win the game. I mean, if your opponent's going to leave up like counterspells, spell pierces for, like Chord of Callings, or they're just going to try to like Stern Scolding, whatever, your Young Wolves, your Ignoble Hierarchs buffing those Young Wolves, your Hapatras, Orcish Bowmasters, and even like Endurances are just going to win the game. And then by the time your opponent is like, okay, I need to interact with the board, they end up wasting all their resources. You finally draw like a Yawgmoth, and you can just end the game, or you can just go get a Shieldred, and your opponent is further behind and more than likely can't get rid of it before the Shieldred does them in. So plenty of things to do. I recommend playing the deck. I cannot recommend it enough. I absolutely love it. I've been playing it for a long time, and unless something catastrophic happens to the deck, or like Yawgmoth gets banned, whatever, I can see myself continuing to play this deck for even longer. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there's any tricks that I might have missed that players should know about. We're here trying to help people learn the Yawgmoth deck and obviously become better players as a whole. So yeah, be sure to leave any tips or tricks, thoughts, opinions, what have you, in the comment section of this video. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. Keep an eye out for the Casual Spikes podcast. Episode's going up on Saturday. We'll have the second official episode uploaded this Saturday, talking about the European RC. And, of course, join the Discord server. The link is in the description, along with the deck list as well. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you all in the next one.